thank you so much for coming, despite the fact that you just had your second shot, but that means that in 2 weeks you could come to visit us at the library. I feel
Yes, right after my mother.
right.
Mom, I'm going to see my mother first.
That's true. That's more important. Karen first spoke here on October 10th, 2002 on her book, She Put Mercury in the Morning Milk, Women
Well,
Criminals in the 18th Century.
I can't hear.
Can you hear that? Hello? Okay.
yes.
Okay, good. Throughout the years, she has spoken on such a wide variety of subjects: American film satire, Langston Hughes and Paul Simon, funny women, heroes of the past, and the current pandemic. And today's topic will be on the war for drugs, men, women, and the history of medicine. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our very special guest and my friend, Karen Gevirtz.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, everybody. I was saying before, it's tough competition, a beautiful spring sunny day. So I really appreciate everybody who's signing in, and I hope that if you're on your phone, that you're maybe sitting outside in the sunshine, enjoying it while I talk about this really cheerful subject. So the War for Drugs is an early title that I had for the book that I'm working on now. That doesn't really have a title right now, but I am writing about the battle over medicinal drugs that took place during the 17th and 18th century. So you're going to get part of a book that I'm working on right now. So if there are questions or things that are not clear or things that you don't think sound good, please let me know. This would be a great time for me to find out that it doesn't work before it goes to a publisher.
It will work.
Thank you, Phyllis. So I'm going to give some background first and then talk about what happened during the 17th and 18th centuries, and then point out ways in which what happened is now happening to us or has implications for our present. So how the past directly affects the present. So to get things started, I don't know if you can see, I don't know if my gallery view here, let me do this. So these are some quotations from a book that I teach from that I really like. And the red sections highlight the parts that I want to emphasize, which is that what happened during the Enlightenments, what happened during the late 17th and the 18th centuries, actually plays right into, it is directly related to what is happening in our world now. And in many ways is the same debate, just in a different form. So arguments about race or about gender, for example, that were happening during the 17th and 18th century are the same arguments. We just might be using different words for it. And I want to set that up because what I'm about to say about the 17th and the 18th century may seem perhaps like a stretch. So I just want to bring in some scholars to back me up who will say, no, it's not a stretch at all. The problems that we're facing now are versions of the problems that we faced then. So what kind of a problem am I talking about? Well, when this period gets started, so let's imagine us about 1649, 1650, the Pilgrims have landed already. They've been in Massachusetts for about 30 years. The Salem witch trials have not happened yet. They're still about 40 years away. Doctors did not have a very good reputation at all. There was a common saying, the physician is worse than the disease. And that really sort of tells you everything. And there were a lot of other sayings that went with it, like, I beg your pardon, like a young physician fattens the churchyard, better wait on the cooks than the mediciners, the vessel of an apothecary often has poison in the bottom, God heals the sick, but the physician takes the fee. So there were a lot of adages about how doctors or the people who made medication were more lethal than they were curative. And in opposite to this, women had a very good reputation. So just like you were not supposed to trust a physician, you were supposed to trust the woman of the family. Kitchen physic, the medicine that's made in your kitchen, is the best physic. So whatever you get at home from mom, that's really the best stuff. So if you're home in 1650 and you're thinking, gee, I've just broken out in purple spots, what should I do? The first thing you're going to think is not, I should go down to see Dr. Smith. What you're going to think is, where's my wife? So these were medications that were based in plant material. They were called organic medication. So when we hear the word organic, we think, people in Birkenstocks sort of wandering around going, it's all natural, man, and stuff like that. But when we talk about organic medication in the history of medicine, we're talking about any medication that is based in plants. And it got a bad rap, and I'm going to talk about how that medication got a bad rap. But in fact, a lot of herbaceous material really does have medicinal properties. So sage, for example, which makes a really tasty stuffing, also is good for reducing fever. Thyme, which is also great for cooking with, makes a very good expectorant. It's good for clearing mucus out of the chest. Foxglove has digitalis, which is a heart medication and good for heart murmurs and heart palpitations. Rosemary, another herb that you'll be able to grow in your backyard, really is good for headaches and some issues with the liver sometimes. Wormwood actually does, it's called wormwood for a reason, it really does expel worms. Turmeric reduces jaundice, which is kind of funny because it's yellow. And licorice, and if you ask any professional singer, they'll tell you this, licorice is a very good expectorant. And singers will often take some licorice. They'll have a piece of candy, a piece of real licorice candy before going on to sing, because it clears their throat so wonderfully. And these are all the foundation of medications that women were actually using. So they were growing these things in their backyard, or they were getting them from their neighbor who might have some in the backyard. And these plants were all on hand. So if you had a sore throat, or if you had a terrible headache or a fever, mom could go right out to the backyard and pick what she needed and give you your meds. And women recorded these recipes in recipe books. And as you can see, Robert Greene certainly thought this was a great idea. If I be ill at ease, he says, I take kitchen physic. I make my wife my doctor and my garden my apothecary's shop. So an apothecary is somebody who makes the medication. They're kind of the equivalent of our pharmacist today. And Robert Greene's saying, you know what, I don't need to go anywhere. I've got my wife. And women kept recipe books. So the same way, even though we're so much more of a digital society than we were, the same way that you might write down recipes that you really like, and you might get it from a friend, right? So you've got a friend who's got a really great recipe for chocolate chip cookies. So you get her recipe for chocolate chip cookies and you write it down somewhere. Or in the old days, we used to keep a box of index cards with the recipes on them. And that's what women did with their recipe books. So if you can see my screen, you'll see two pages from the same recipe book that was started around 1700. And on one page, it's a list of recipes for making medicine, because medicine was made at home. And the next page, or facing page actually, was recipes for seafood. So if it was made at home, if it was made in the kitchen, if it was boiled, baked, strained, if it was roasted in some way, distilled in some way, any of that stuff, any of those processes, that happened in the kitchen, and it required a recipe. So food and medicine were really not considered separate. They were considered the same thing. They were the thing you had at home, and women were in charge. And women passed these recipe books from generation to generation. And this is a great example of it. If you can see the screen, then you can see that the flyleaf of this recipe book has the first owner of the book, which who wrote down the year 1634. And then the second owner of the book wrote down 1669. So she got it 35 years later. And then The next owner of the book, so her daughter got it in 1708, or maybe her granddaughter got it in 1708. So these recipe books were passed generation to generation to generation. As you can see, a recipe book that gets started in 1634 and is still in use in 1708 is a precious family heirloom. And it's not precious in the sense of you lock it up and you don't use it. It's precious in the sense of this is what makes families go. And you might see the handwriting of women that you really love in this book with you. So you'll see your mother's handwriting or your grandmother's handwriting or your aunt or a friend who wrote down a recipe she really loves. And in a time when people died a lot younger than they do now, and women's chance of dying in childbirth was extremely high, you might have this might be the only evidence that you have of somebody you really, really loved. And so recipe books were precious for a lot of reasons. So the slide that I'm showing now, for those of you who can see it on the screen, is a list of recipes for medication. So the top recipe says a water for the lungs. So if you've probably got some sort of a cough, distill colt's foot. Colt's foot is a little yellow flower. It looks a lot like a tiny little dandelion, right? And then and maidenhair together. So you make basically almost like a wine. You take 2 or 3 spoonfuls of that mixture, and then you stir it together with sugar, and then you drink it. And so, the sugar was probably to make it taste good. Whatever liquid that you got from distilling colt's foot and maidenhair, maybe not tasting so good. So there's a julep for the lungs, and in that case you take hartshorn. So there are different ways of treating different things and lots of different substances. The way we have capsules, pills, syrups, IV, all of those things, they had lots of different forms for medication too. And this was called by the professionals Materia Medica. So materia means material and medical means medical. Medica means medical. And the professionals were using the same kind of stuff that that the women were using. And they had, for those of you who can see my screen, they also had books of plants that told them what plant to use. And before there was printing, these were handmade books, and they were beautiful, absolutely beautiful. They were illustrated in any way that the author wanted them to be illustrated, and you could copy down one person's book and put in your illustrations the way you wanted. And so you'll see books of medicinal plants called herbals, where the plants are growing through the words, or their roots are coming down from the top of the page, or they're twining vines around the print or around the margin of the page. So these books were really beautiful, but the important point to remember is that the professionals are making medicine from the exact same stuff that women were making medicine from. They were making it from anise, like licorice. They were making it from hartshorn. They were making it from dandelion, and so on. So they were making it from the same stuff. And as the universities became more established through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, they started planting medicinal gardens for the doctors who were in training. And the medicinal gardens were laid out usually in 4 parts for the different kind of main sections of a body that might get sick, like the head or like the lungs. And that was how professionals were trained in the garden. They had to learn the same way women did. Then the scientific revolution came along. And the scientific revolution changed a lot of things. And one of the things that it changed was the idea that you could rely on what somebody said to be true. That the scientific revolution said, well, let's make sure that everything is true by doing experiments or observing and getting evidence for all of this. The scientific revolution was much more available to men than it was to women. Men were going to the universities. Men had their own money, so they could buy books. Men had more time to correspond with each other and to share each other's letters. Men got the education to speak and read Latin, which was how people across Europe could communicate. Latin was the shared language for everybody. And so the scientific revolution really takes hold primarily because of men. It's not unavailable to women, but it's much harder for women to get access to the ideas. And a big idea from the scientific revolution is a Latin phrase that the Royal Society in London has, which is nullius in verba, which means nothing by words, nothing in words, meaning you don't take somebody's word for it. You do experiments and find out. So what the physicians wanted and what the apothecaries wanted and what professional healthcare providers wanted was they wanted respect. So they didn't want people to keep using those nasty adages about doctors killing people. And they wanted respect because they wanted people to turn to them and to say, I'm covered with itchy purple spots. I should check with Dr. Smith. They also wanted money. They wanted to be paid. That was how they made a living. So one thing was they wanted people to pay for their expertise, and they wanted people to pay for their product, for the medicine. So when you go to a doctor, for example, and you get a prescription, you're paying one for the knowledge that the doctor has, but then you have to go and buy the medication separately. And that's what the professionals wanted as the scientific revolution comes along. So in England in 1650, to go back to that key date, we're on the brink of the scientific revolution. They're just about to start in with it, and this is where they want things to go. The professionals want respect and they want money. So they have a 5-step process for getting respect and getting money. And one of them is they regender medication. So until this point, people think of medication as something female. It's the sort of thing that mom makes, the way she makes clothes. Well, if you start writing the same way women wrote in recipe books, but you make them print books and you make them paid for, then people start thinking of medicinal knowledge as something that men produce and that you have to pay for. So they start thinking of it not as female, but as male, not as domestic, but as commercial, not as free. You can just ask your neighbor for a recipe, but as something you have to buy. The next step was separating food and medicine. And of course, as you might imagine, women get the food and men get the medicine. So until this point, because everything's made in the kitchen, women are responsible for food and medicine, and food and medicine aren't really all that different. Well, now you've got food very different from medicine. So that nice soup that you make, that's okay for Mrs. Smith, but the medication, that belongs to Dr. Smith. So they separated it out. So food no longer belonged to women, food belonged to women, belonged to the kitchen, and medicine belonged to men and belonged to laboratories. So the next step was people had to learn to pay for it. They were getting it for free at home, right? You would turn to your wife or you would turn to your mother and you'd say, have I got a headache? And she would say, I got some great tea for that. Or lie down, I've got a nice thing to smear on your forehead, or whatever it was. Remember that a lot of these things worked, though. So people had to be taught to pay for something that they were getting for free. So that was a tough one. And one of the things that they did was they persuaded people that professionally made medication was the really great hot stuff. It was new. It had new knowledge behind it. And it didn't, but they said that it did. And another thing that the physicians and apothecaries did was they stopped taking care of poor people, basically. For a lot of poor people, medication was what you got at home. Doctors, for a while at the end of the 17th century, and apothecaries who made medicine thought, well, maybe we should take care of the poor people too. And if they ever make some money, they can pay us, and this would be good. And it's kind of a good thing to do. And they really gave up on it. So the dispensary was the free clinic that the doctors started, and it was a disaster. So if you can see my screen, you can see that that there was one of the doctors wrote a poem about how the dispensary was a terrible failure. And it was so popular that it went to 3 or 4 editions. He changed it every time it came out to update it, to make fun of other people. So that was step 3, making sure that people learn to pay for medicine instead of to get it at home for free. Step 4 was to change people's ideas and attitudes towards science. So with the scientific revolution, people are going, I don't know, it's kind of newfangled, right? I mean, if you think about when the internet started or cell phones started, it was sort of like, is this a fad or is this really going to catch on? Well, that was the same problem for the scientific revolution. So what they had to do was they had to teach people, the doctors and the apothecaries, that science is really cool. Not only is science really cool, science is the best kind of knowledge there is. And it is so impressive and so amazing that only really special people can comprehend it, which means women cannot and poor people cannot. They do not have that special something. But affluent white men, sure, no problem. And the last step was they persuaded people that medication, good medication, great medication, was actually made with chemicals and wasn't made with organic materials at all. So you wanted a really good expectorant? Yeah, don't use that, that licorice. No. What you want is something that's made in a laboratory with these kind of nifty bubbling things, and you have to wear a special white coat and all that sort of stuff. The reality was for a long time that they were still making medication the same way, but they told everybody that they were making it from chemicals and they were making it in laboratories. And that's how they got people to stop thinking of medication as this free, domestic, female product and started thinking of it as a commercial, chemical male product. So they started the prescription system, which we still have, which was a way of making sure that people who entered into the medical system paid everybody. So the doctors and the apothecaries worked together. If you were the doctor, you got paid for a visit. So somebody would come to you with their purple itchy spots and the doctor would say, aha, you have this mysterious thing. And they'd say a lot of Latin. And then they'd say, that'll be a guinea, please. That'll be £1. And you go, okay. And then the doctor says, you need medication to take care of this. Here's a prescription. Now go to my friend, the apothecary, and he will mix it up for you. And then you would take your medication for your itchy purple spots to the apothecary, who would follow whatever the recipe was for that medication, make it up, and you would take it home. And so that was how the medication system that we have today got started. They started a system by which the only people who could make money were the doctors and the apothecaries. And the only way to get medication was by going first to a doctor. So it was a really great system. It's still a really great system. If you think about the way nobody's really keeping an eye on anybody, right? The opioid crisis, which is just one of many, many crises with overprescription that we've had in the history of medication. The opioid crisis came about in part because nobody was watching. Nobody was saying to doctors, that's an awful lot of meds you're prescribing, and nobody was saying to pharmacies, how many pills of that kind are you handing out a week, right? So that's how the prescription system got started. There was also the beginning of regulation, and a great story about regulation is the story of Joanna Stevens. So Joanna Stevens was a woman who did not have a medical degree, but she did have a recipe for what was called the stone, so for kidney and bladder stones. And she was very popular. Her medication sold very, very well. And the doctors and the pharmacists, the apothecaries, did not like Joanna Stevens because people were buying it from her and they weren't buying it from the apothecaries, and they were self-diagnosing. They were saying, I've got a bladder stone. I'm going to go to Joanna Stevens and get some of her medication instead of going to doctors. So the Royal College of Physicians got really suspicious and they accused her of being a fraud, of being a quack. And they waged a public campaign in the newspapers to force her to give them the recipe for her medication. Well, if everybody had the recipe for the medication, then nobody would want to pay her for it. So there's no way that she would want to give them the recipe for this. But what they said was, if she didn't, then they would go around saying that she was a fraud, and they would affect her sales also. So she was pressured into it. She gave them the recipe. They conducted a bunch of tests on it, and they discovered that, lo and behold, it really did work. But by this time, they had the medication, and so they started selling it. So Joanna Stevens was right out of business. And they did that because they felt that medication should be checked and regulated and tested by professionals. And they didn't think that somebody who didn't have the right qualifications should be making medicine. Well, this should be a pretty familiar idea to us, right? So you can't just go around making up medication and selling it. And that's part of what the FDA does. It says colloidal silver is not a cure for coronavirus, and you can't sell it and say that it is. So we saw at the beginning also a regulation which was used also to drive women out of the medication business, also to get women to stop giving people medication, to get people to stop thinking of women as the suppliers of medication. So why isn't this about better medication? Because better medication didn't come along for another century. So when did we start getting morphine? 1803. Joanna Stevens is 1736. Right? That's almost 70 years earlier. Quinine for malaria, we don't get quinine as a drug until 1820. So if you wanted a painkiller, you might take a whole bunch of local painkillers, or you would use poppy. If you wanted quinine, you would make tea from cinchona bark. Now the drugs were extracted from the bark, and you could actually just take the straight up quinine. Salicin, which is what's in aspirin, it was separated from willow bark. Willow bark tea was used as a painkiller, like to get rid of headaches. Well, you needed to make your tea until 1826. You couldn't get salicin out of the willow bark and use it as a powder that you mixed right back into a drink again until 1826. And you didn't get a salicin tablet and aspirin until 1897. Laughing gas wasn't used as an anesthetic until 1844. We didn't have penicillin until 1928. We didn't have sulfa drugs until 1935. So all this time that the male professionals are saying, buy our drugs are better, their drugs are not better. So what it is it's a really fantastic public relations campaign. It's like the best advertising campaign you've ever seen. So just to summarize where we are, because I've just done a whole lot of talking. The physicians and the apothecaries got together and they did a 5-step process. Step 1, science is male. Step 2, food is different from drugs. Step 3, medication is something that you pay for. It's a commodity. Well, what have we got from that? Are we still living with this? Sure, of course. One thing is we've got a huge gender imbalance in STEM fields. It's really find a female engineer or a female physicist. Another issue is that women didn't start being included in drug trials until the 1990s. The NIH discovered that women were in drug trials and that they decided this was a problem in 1986. And so they mandated that drug trials had to include women. But even then, the drug companies didn't want to start using women, didn't want to start testing meds on women until the 1990s. Step 2, that food is different from drugs. Well, what have we got today? We've got superfoods, we've got energy drinks, we've got the idea that diet is a medical intervention. Well, you've got, your cholesterol's too high. You got to do something about your diet, as opposed to the way it was before, which is just you ate in order to take care of yourself. It was just part of the way people thought about being a person. What else is the legacy? The Food and Drug Administration, which regulates these things. And then this question of what's iodized salt? Iodized salt is medicinal. it's iodized because it addresses thyroid problems. Well, is iodized salt food or medicine in that case? And the idea that medication is something to be paid for, it's private property that you buy from somebody else, that's the adversarial relationship between brand name pharmaceutical companies and the companies that make generics. And by the way, there's a really good book about this, and it's called, oh golly, now of course I can't remember it. It's by Catherine Eban, and it's really, really good. We also have a patent system, which says if you invent a medicinal molecule, you own it. And it's not a crime to deny life-saving medication to people who can't pay for it. So if you're a diabetic and you need your insulin and you don't have enough money to buy a full month supply of insulin, the pharmacist who doesn't sell it to you is not committing a crime, even though they're withholding something that is necessary for your life. The pharmaceutical company that is selling the insulin and won't sell it to you unless you have enough money is not committing a crime, even though you need the insulin for your life. So that's the legacy that we've got from the idea that medication is a commodity. What about the other steps? That science is superior to everything else and only men can do it. And the fifth step, that medication is chemical. Again, that's where the gender imbalance in STEM comes from. And there's been a reaction to that idea that science is the great answer for everything. And that's the suspicion of science that we see, especially in the United States. Those anti-vaxxers, people who sell colloidal silver, all that sort of thing. And in terms of medication as chemical, again, the patent system, the fact that the supply chain requires a supply of substances for concocting these things, and also the fact that nobody is really aware of the fact that at the bottom of the supply chain is actually a lot of botanical stuff. Where are a lot of these medications beginning? They're beginning in greenhouses, and they're beginning in greenhouses in places like Australia and China. But pharmaceutical companies don't talk about that because medication is chemical. And it also means that when scientists from those pharmaceutical companies went into third world countries to find out what plants they used for medicines, they didn't pay those indigenous peoples for their medication. So medications that have turned into major treatments, like the Madagascar periwinkle, which is the foundation for a lot of cancer meds, Madagascar hasn't made a penny off that. And the Madagascar periwinkle only grows in Madagascar. But Madagascar is incredibly poor because the pharmaceutical companies never paid them for it. So where are we now? Well, to begin with, we started with women making medication as part of their domestic responsibilities. And that medicine was free, and the knowledge was free. It was handed from mother to daughter. It was handed from friend to friend, from neighbor to neighbor. And it was tested by trying it out. If this medication didn't work on your husband, then maybe this other medication will work on your husband. So it was free, organic, and made at home from ingredients that were readily available. Well, as a result of the brilliant PR campaign and the deliberate attempts by male professionals to take medication away from women, we get the foundations of big pharma. What else? We have a change in gender associations, that medication is associated with men. We have a change from thinking of medication as having an organic foundation to having a chemical foundation, to being or not organic, but chemical. And we have a whole market for medication instead of like being able to get it at home. And we have the prescription system, which can be really good. I'm not saying all of these things are bad, but I'm saying these are the things that we've inherited, and we've inherited regulation. So some of these things make some really big problems, like the gender imbalance in STEM and the commodification of medication. Some of these things don't necessarily make huge problems, like regulation. In principle, regulation, we could argue, is a pretty good idea. So for those of you who can see my screen, you'll see that I've got a picture of a really beautiful garden here. And this is the medicinal garden at Seton House in England. It's very large, and it's organized in 4 sections. And this picture was taken probably in late July, early August. And it, yeah, because the apples aren't in season yet. And all the plants that a woman would have needed for her medications would have been here. So there's thyme in the front of this picture in the foreground, and facing opposite to the thyme, there's of all things, artichokes. And then at the back, there was different kind of lady's mantle, for example. So there's all sorts of things in here, and that's what you would have had in the backyard. Maybe not as beautiful and as formal as this, but you would have had something in the backyard to go to, and that's something we've really lost. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to say thank you for sticking with me, especially for those who couldn't see the screen, and invite you, implore you to ask questions and to make comments, because the good part begins. Now the discussion starts.
Well, now you were fabulous. We loved it.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you.
And is there a question there?
Phyllis, you might be able to mute people.
I can't.
Nope. Okay, so that's just Michael. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think I read the
I can't hear you now. I read, and then I don't hear anymore. Does anybody else hear her?
No. I started to hear her, and then no more.
I think she's dropped off the call.
But there's background talking.
Yeah, somebody has one of the telephone numbers, 762-4149, has you can tell from the yellow bar underneath.
Oh, there's Tracy now.
Hi, Tracy, you're back. Yes.
Yeah. How I made a boo-boo. I apologize for that. Okay. I read
Lost her again. Oh dear.
It's unusual. She's usually, no
There
problem.
must just be like a hair trigger on something.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Let me see if she can answer by chat. Oh, she's back. Great. Yay.
Okay, I'm sorry. My phone is doing some very strange things. Okay, I read The Great Influenza, and I thought it was a fantastic read, given the fact that we're in the midst of pandemic and all that.
Yeah.
But what I learned in reading that book was the medical system here in the United States was just so backward.
Yeah.
In the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
And that coincided a lot with my grandmother's perspective of, oh no, you just don't go to a doctor because they don't know what they're doing. And my orientation was totally different, having grown up in the latter part of the 20th century and understanding that we have this great medical community. So one thing that book also enlightened me about was that we didn't necessarily have the kind of research commitment here in the United States that was going on in other parts of the world, primarily in Europe.
Yes.
So they were advancing much more quickly than we were, and
Yes.
developing medical treatments and procedures, not just medicines themselves, and procedures that well exceeded what we were doing here.
Yes.
But keeping all that in mind, my grandmother also had a sense of what you needed to take if something was going wrong. How do you actually manage, treatment of a stomach ache? And, if you have constipation, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And I do recall at some point in my life saying, why don't we just go to the pharmacy? I don't really understand.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up with a great insurance plan. I grew up in a suburban area where, everybody went to the doctor, and we did go to the doctor, obviously. But there was a whole sense that my grandmother had a perspective on what you needed to do to actually mitigate some medical situations. Not so much having a bladder stone. I don't remember anything of that kind, but just common kind of everyday ailments. And in addition to that, I think I recall going to the cloisters one year.
Yes, yes.
And a medicinal garden there.
They do. Yeah, it's a lovely one.
And I agree with
And they
you.
talking about the fact that this medicinal garden was something that everyone would have had,
Yep. Yep.
at their home during certain periods of time in history, so they could then treat the conditions and ailments that arose in their family members.
Yes.
So yeah, the picture of your garden reminded me of that. That may have been, I don't know, 5 years ago. It's been a long time since I've been to the cloisters. But with all that being said, I'm wondering, how does our quote unquote, I don't want to say fascination, but our clear propensity for supplements now,
Yes.
how does that compare to, and how has that been developed to the same extent? I think somewhat similarly to medications.
Yes.
To pharmaceuticals. Let me say pharmaceuticals versus medications.
Yes. Yes.
And the whole concept of making people pay for something that they got for free reminded me of spring water and just water in general.
Yes.
That we spend a lot of money on water that we never spent on water,
Right.
40 years ago.
Right.
So this whole industry of supplements, natural as they may be and unnatural as they may be, because many of them don't seem very natural at all.
Right.
How does that fit into your research and what you're doing around, medicinal development and pharmaceuticals? And now we have moved into this whole supplement era.
Yeah. So this is a really great question. Thank you so much for asking it. I actually have a whole chapter on this subject in the second half of my book. So the first half is the talk that you just saw, basically, and the second half is examples of the manifestation of this in American medication. And I agree with you 100%. What I think happened with the separation of food and medication is that there was sort of a medicalization of health. And so there was the idea that it needed to be manipulated and controlled. And in order to manipulate the body to get it to be in certain states of health, what you needed was medication, as opposed to just eat an apple a day, right? Like that sort of thing. So a couple things about what you said. The American pharmaceutical industry really didn't catch up with Europe until the 20th century. So all the big breakthroughs are coming out of, especially Germany, until World War I, World War II. And I put in the chat Gerald Posner's book on this, and I think it's called Pharma, is super good on it. I really like it, his book, and it's very readable. It's great. So you really get that medicalization of health. And when you get after World War II, the food industry really takes off after World War II. So partly it takes off because big business starts up, partly it takes off because there's all this technology for preserving food that was developed for the troops in World War II. Partly it takes off because of the Cold War, and supermarkets were created to sort of showcase American plenitude. What you got is a whole industry that treats food like a commodity, in the way that medication is treated like a commodity. And so it becomes broken down into its component parts. So it's not that you eat salmon for dinner, it's that you eat salmon because of the omega-3s and the vitamin D and the calcium, right? It's not just salmon is good. Try it with some lemon, right? So we don't have that sense. So the whole sense of what it means to live in a body is really different because of this. And so we think of adjusting the states of the body by putting discrete things into it. And that's this whole ethos that comes from this idea about medication that comes out of the scientific revolution. I mean, if I could go back and smack one person in history who isn't Hitler, I would go back and smack Descartes, because he said that the mind and the body are separate. This is a really stupid idea. After Descartes, I would smack Locke for saying that, babies are born as a tabula rasa, because the man obviously never met a baby. But, and that's just a whole other problem. But so this idea that things can be separated out, that we can treat parts of the body discreetly, that you can inject it, so to speak, let's, eat your handful of blueberries and your cognitive processes will be better, all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. Oh, okay.
So Tracy, to finish, yes, absolutely. That's a late 20th century thing. And a lot of that comes from the development of industry through the 30s and especially the 40s. Yeah. But there's a very good, the biography of the Blackwell sisters. Let me also recommend that. Oh my God. I can't remember now. Naomi, I can't remember. No, it's not Naomi. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's very good. The book is called The Sisters Blackwell. And it's 2020. It just came out, I think, by Norton. And it's really good in terms of sort of explaining what the state of American medicine was like in the early and mid 19th century. And it was appalling.
Mhm.
It was just appalling. Yeah. Being a doctor didn't get respectable in the United States for a good 100 years after it was in England. So you could be respectable as a doctor in England easily by the beginning of the 18th century. Doctors were still really regarded with suspicion for a very, very long time in the US, and with reason.
Yeah, and I think that if I recall correctly, that you didn't necessarily have to have an undergraduate degree to go to medical school.
Nope.
You didn't have to pass any kind of a standardized test to graduate
Nope.
from medical school.
That's
There were
correct.
no standards.
Right.
And you were deemed, once you went through quote unquote the program, you got your certificate of completion and you were a doctor.
Yeah.
And there were no rounds.
Great.
No, there was no directly with patients. You
Right.
didn't see any people. You didn't see the effect of medications on people. It was like a lecture, like a
Yeah,
glorified
that's
lecture.
exactly what it was.
And
Yeah.
then you went out and quote unquote practice medicine. So
Yeah.
it was really, really much more scary than I thought. And my grandmother was so right. I just had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a great short story by a Russian doctor actually named Mikhail Bulgakov, and it's autobiographical, where he talks about the fact that he has to deliver a breech baby and he's never delivered a breech baby before. And so he gets called in for the emergency birth into this country hospital. The baby is breech and he's like, I just have to check one thing. And he runs in a panic back to his house where he's frantically leafing through his book because he's no idea what to do because he's never had to deliver a breech baby before. And so he's trying to learn all of this. And he's like, I never actually did this. I never actually saw any of this happen. And so what happens is that the nurse, between the textbook and the nurse, he kind of makes it all happen and everybody's fine. But it's a really good example of that. Yeah. And it was very different in what became Great Britain. You needed to be licensed, and not every medical school was accepted. And you were expected to do you had to do a 7-year apprenticeship if you wanted to be an apothecary. I mean, you could not open an apothecary shop unless you served an apprenticeship. That was the same for the barber surgeons. They had an apprenticeship program. So England was Great Britain was way, way ahead of the United States in that regard. So we were, people want to say we were a tough little scrappy country, but the fact of the matter is that we've never really been great with regulation. We've always been a little suspicious of education. So. And if people can see the chat, as I'm mentioning books, I'm just putting them into the chat if anybody's interested in titles.
I wanted to say something about the changing medicines, like penicillin was, you had a cold, the doctor would give you a penicillin shot.
Mm-hmm.
And the antibiotics are not given out freely at all. So they have learned, but I have a doctor who was wonderful, an older man. And I remember one time saying something about an antibiotic, and he goes, Phyllis, the first day I went into med school, on the blackboard, it said, all medicines are poison. And he's not a believer in giving medicine. And he said, and if it's not poison, it could hurt someone because each person's body reacts differently.
Yep.
So,
That's the saying, right? Kitchen physic is the best physic. This idea that, well, you know what? Try rest and fluids and some chicken soup first. Maybe you don't, right? Maybe you don't need the pill right away. Maybe, and that whole, the medicalization of ill health or of good health has meant if you look at the statistics for the United States, Americans take the most drugs of anybody in the world. The quality of our health is very low. So there's no correlation between how much medication we take and how good our health is. Possibly an inverse, if anything. So in countries where there's a very different approach to health, also there's, a public health system, which we do not really have. We have something that we like to call a public health system, which is kind of cute, right? But in countries with a public health system, you have much more sort of coordination with people's lives. And so the whole idea of sickness and health is not completely different, but somewhat different, enough different from our own, that the standard of living is different, the quality of health is different. And these aren't my statistics. These are, like the UN statistics, the WHO statistics. So, yeah.
So Karen, in your research,
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that there were many early medicines that had appropriated recipes from other countries and other parts of the world?
So,
before Big Pharma and before.
No, you're talking about like imperialism. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the British Empire. So the recipes did to some extent, but definitely the medicinal substances were. So the British Empire was particularly good at this, but the Dutch were also really good at this, which is on any expedition, like Captain Cook, there was a botanist on board, and his whole job was to collect plants like crazy. And whenever they ran into another Royal Navy ship that was sailing back, they would put hundreds of specimens on board, and they would talk to the indigenous peoples as much as possible and find out, what fruit, how you dealt with it, that sort of thing. So there was a huge, what I would call appropriating of knowledge and sort of a seizing of goods, as it were. So it's not that they didn't leave any breadfruit trees in Tahiti, which is the purpose of Captain Bligh's voyage, but it's just that they then took them back and did with them what they wanted. And this whole attitude of they've got hold of something and it's mostly by accident, they don't really know what they have, and we're going to take it back and apply Western science to it, and we're going to make it so much better, and we don't really have to say that it came from this people or that people, because they're people of color and they don't speak English, so what do we care? Right. They're probably not people at all, depending on what century you're talking to them. So in terms of that kind of imperialism, absolutely, yes. It's created a field called ethnomedicine, which is an attempt to reverse that process. So ethnomedicine is scientists and physicians going into the places where traditional medicines are practiced, learning those medications, learning how they do that, taking them back to the laboratory, finding out whether they work and how they work, and then developing treatments from them, but crediting the people and paying them for it. So it would be really nice if the people who were making all those cancer meds from Madagascar periwinkle would start paying just a little bit of their monster profits to Madagascar, for example. It wouldn't be so awful if Big Pharma threw its muscle behind saving the Amazon and maybe the rest of the planet, since the foundation of their meds is mostly plants, like the vast majority. But that's because of the myth of chemistry. They would have to admit that they're getting it from plants, and God knows what would happen then. So that's the long answer to yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm wondering too if we're really eating food anymore in the United States, because we have cross-pollinated and we've created food, something that was very natural. We've then made it a outgrowth of chemical manipulation.
Yes.
So to what extent are we really eating food? I'm thinking back to my daughter when she spent a semester in Germany, and she felt that the food was so much fresher and the taste was so much better, believing that it was locally sourced and not necessarily grown by like farming corporations like we have here in the United States. And given, we as capitalists, and that's what we are focused on making money, and that's what we do in this country. And it's the cheapest way to make a product that will taste as good as it can be under the parameters of its cost, that people will buy it. So we don't really care so much about what the overall effect is, as long as we're selling it and making money. So I think we've fallen victim to that somewhat in the United States with regard to how we produce food here. And the food we eat, I'm not so sure it's really food anymore. That our bodies really, I shouldn't say that. I don't think our bodies ingest the nutrients, if there are any, to the same extent that it might have happened 100 years ago when we were eating things locally sourced.
Right. I wouldn't be able to comment on. I can talk about questions of agribusiness, right? That agribusiness is actually horrendous for the environment. It's terrible for the planet. It doesn't maximize nutrition or food safety or public health. It really does prioritize corporate gain. And that's the thing. I remember hearing a debate in Congress about childcare. And this was a long time ago, because they've been arguing about childcare in Congress for a very long time. And some, I don't remember if it was a representative or a senator, was up on the floor going, "We can't do this because it's bad for business." And I was like, who the heck cares? Like, they're people. I think it's okay to have fewer, profits, less profits, if what you have is better people. So, which is really unfashionable in certain circles, I realize. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that. Europe, especially, and probably pretty much anywhere else, maintains the tradition of regular marketing, right? That you go out at some point during the day and you get dinner. So there's a butcher, and you say, "So, whoever, to your butcher, what's good today," right? Or you would say to the fishmonger, "What's good?" Or you would go to the market and you would, you'd buy your onions from somebody you knew. We really, we've sort of exoticized that and made it a very upper class thing by calling it a farmer's market now, as opposed to just how people get their food. And so again, that corporatization has been really damaging. So yeah, those tomatoes that are green when they're picked and they're pink when they get to the supermarket and they never really turn red, I doubt that the beta carotene in those really matches up to the thing that you grow in your backyard, right? There was so Arthur the Aardvark is a children's book character. I don't know how many of you know Arthur, who's sweet, a little bit weird looking, but very sweet. I mean, all the animals in those books, I think, are a little bit, anyway. And there's a really good episode of Arthur where I think it's Arthur goes to, or maybe it's his friend, goes to a community garden and eats a tomato off the vine by accident. Like, he just winds up with this tomato and somebody goes, "Well, go ahead, okay, eat it." And he's like, "Oh my God," like he's never had a tomato like this ever. And it's an amazing episode, because what happens is the friend brings this tomato to his friends and he says, you have to try this. And so all the little kids are going, now that's a tomato. Like they've never had anything like this. And so, so the whole point of this episode is to get people to start growing in their backyard and to sponsor community gardens and to start eating things that are really actually grown to be eaten when they're ripe, like then. And that's something it's taking us, we use it. World War II was good about this because everybody had a victory garden. If you could afford to have a victory garden, you did, right? Because all the troops needed whatever they needed. So you grew your own asparagus or peppers or tomatoes. And then everybody was like, no, we have to support business. And what you really need is you need a green lawn that's been treated with cancer-causing chemicals. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know about whether agribusiness's product has changed kind of human physiology or in the United States. I am simply not qualified to talk about that. But do I think a pale pink tomato is as good for you as a really nice juicy one? No, not a chance. There's just look at it. There's no way it could possibly be as good.
The problem is that to get fresh tomatoes or any kind of organic food, it's pricier.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's hurting the poor who may need the nutrients, the fresh.
Mm-hmm. So Barbara Kingsolver has a great book. It's called Animal Vegetable Miracle. And if you haven't read it, and I'm saying this to everybody, if you haven't read it, allow me to strongly recommend it. It is beautiful. It is a beautiful book. And one of the things that she talks about is the American reluctance to pay farmers what their product is actually worth. That Americans will pay all sorts of crazy money for cell phones and televisions, but we have a bizarre reluctance to pay a farmer what the farmer's time and land and resources and red ripe tomato are truly worth. And she says it's a problem of American values that we're ready to pay for some things and not for others. And she says several times in the book, and beautifully every time, buy the organic if you can. Support the farmer who has taken the time to grow something that is good for you when it was so easy for them not to. If you can afford it, do it. She's very clear. She doesn't say, you must switch to organic. She says, if you can buy the organic carrots instead of the non-organic carrots, buy the organic carrots, buy that organic lettuce. You don't need to buy an organic pumpkin because it's got a nice strong rind, but you try to buy those organic apples. So she's really good about it. And she says, just do what you can. We need to believe that farming matters. We need to recognize that. So allow me to recommend yet another book. And I don't love Barbara Kingsolver for everything. This happens to be one of her really, really good ones.
Well, you are wonderful, and you enlightened us. And I was thinking of the book Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Yep.
So it not helps the mind. I mean, not only nutrition-wise, it's for the soul.
Well, so a perfect example of that is, Maimonides says that when you're sick, you should have a bowl of chicken soup. And so somebody went out and chemically analyzed chicken soup to see if it was real. And it's like, people really, why? Why do you need to have a laboratory tell you that chicken soup is good? So, and I mean, I respect science. I do, trust me. I worked in a science lab for a year. I was pre-med. I do history of science stuff. I really love science. And goodness knows I take enough medications myself that I wouldn't really want to do without. But it's at a certain point, it's like, just drink the soup, eat the red tomato.
It can't hurt.
I mean, you don't need to medicalize it. It doesn't not everything needs to be medicalized. Getting 8 hours of sleep is just good for you, so just get your 8 hours of sleep because you're a person. So.
Well, Thank
I'm a
you.
little huffy. I have
Yeah,
teenagers
thank
who
you,
are nocturnal.
Karen.
So thank you, everybody, very
Yeah.
much. Thanks so much
Thank you.
for listening. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you so much for all your questions and comments. Thank you. Phyllis, as always, thank you very much.
Right, Phyllis and Mike, thanks.